This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 178. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 178 of the Building Automation Monthly Podcast. In this episode, we are going to be discussing the 11 things I learned running the fastest growing BAS training company in the world. Yes, we are growing crazy fast and adding a ton of students to our programs. But I never thought it would be like this back when I started Building Automation Monthly back in 2012 as just a hobby blog. That's all it was. And so in this episode, we're going to go through what these insights are that I've identified by training all of these folks, creating courses, working with some of the largest building automation companies in the world, and just seeing what works and what doesn't work. So if you are someone who's looking to get into BAS, there will be stuff you can take out of this episode. If you're someone who manages folks, or you're maybe trying to grow and you're later in your career in building automation, you're going to take stuff out of this. And I think overall, you all are going to find a lot of value just in these insights and perspectives because they're based on actual data and not just based on feelings, which surprisingly, a lot of training decisions are based on people's own experience with how were they trained, as well as just what do they feel is working. So fortunately, we're basing these insights on data and not just on what feels like it works. All right, so today's episode is brought to you by our building automation training courses, all 11 of them. We have courses that cover pretty much every topic you can think of, from sales to project management to systems integration to programming. And we have dedicated skill assessments that help folks identify what skills they need to develop. And then based on that, we're able to create customized training plans. And we're doing this for some of the largest BAS companies in the world. So if you're interested in learning more about how you can utilize our skill assessments and customized training plans to either develop yourself or to develop your team, then I encourage you to go to buildingautomationmonthly.com/178 and click on the Building Automation Monthly logo, which will be about halfway down the page. All right. So as I mentioned, Building Automation Monthly was formed back in 2012. It was like a creative outlet for me, a way for me to take all these crazy ideas that were in my head and translate them onto paper where other folks could read about the crazy ideas that were in my head around building automation and where I thought it was going and what I thought people needed to know. But it became an actual formal training business in November of 2017. At that time, I was working as the program manager for the technical integration program at Johnson Controls, and decided to leave and continue growing my training business, which at the time had two courses. We had a kind of distance course that was a book and a bunch of videos, and we had an IT course. And since that time, we've had about 4,600 students who have gone through our programs. And as I look back and I realize kind of how the programs were developed, in the beginning, I'm not going to lie to you, it's like any business. We were just reacting to customers. Customers would say, hey, we need this. And so we would go and create that. But as we started to introduce feedback loops into that process and introduced a skill assessment into that process, we were able to identify what folks actually needed to know. And so over this time period, we've been able to identify, and there's a lot more than the 11 insights, but I'm going to pick 11 insights because these are the ones that are most pressing in my mind, and they're not in any particular order, but each one of them has a lot of value in itself. So I really encourage you to take some notes on what we're going to discuss here. So insight number 1 is to focus on the most profitable tasks. I don't know about you, but when I started in this field, I was given hey, go and follow someone around and do menial tasks that you really don't even understand why you're doing these tasks, but you're doing them. Maybe you're going around and pulling some wires down from the ceiling down into the drywall and mounting some wall mount thermistors. Or maybe you're going and just addressing controllers, but you're like, why am I doing this? And when you think about it, is that the most profitable tasks? And so what I encourage folks to do, and this is something we talk about in our courses, this is something we've talked about in past podcast episodes, this is something I've talked about one-on-one with our customers when I talk to them on our phone calls, is going and figuring out where your profitability is within your business. So this is everything from when you're doing projects, making sure that you're logging tasks using task codes so that hey, this is the point-to-point task code, this is the install task code, this is the programming task code, and you know where you're slipping as far as your efficiency of your team and where you're like having really great moments of profitability. Because if you notice that, for example, your programming is consistently not profitable and you've ruled out the fact that it is the salespeople just not properly estimating enough programming hours, then you can say that your most profitable task could be programming, which, I mean, arguably that's one of the areas you make the most profit on. And so you say, hey, I need to go and increase the proficiency of this skill set. I feel like a lot of folks go and they react. And I know I'm using the word feeling. When I kicked off the episode, I said this is based on data. Well, based on our assessment, what we see is that there are a significant shortage of skills in areas like loop tuning, in areas of programming, in areas of network setup, all these areas that when you start to think about why do I get called back to a job site, often it's the point-to-point wasn't done properly, the loops aren't tuned, the programming's not properly implemented, things like that. So by focusing on those tasks, rather than what you feel is the most profitable task, by focusing on those tasks, you're able to be more profitable. You're able to have more cash flow in your business. If you have more cash flow in your business, then you're able to hire more people. You hire more people, that naturally makes things easier. In addition to that, right? So in addition to that, as a professional working in this trade, the more profitable you are for your business, the more leverage you have to discuss raises, the more valuable you are when times get lean and maybe we go into a recession, and you are more profitable than your peers. Thus, all things equal, you're going to have a job when other people start getting let go. So focusing on the most profitable tasks is pretty important. I'm not going to say it's number 1. Like I said, these are not in any particular order. So insight number 2, and this one was pretty surprising to me, but programming is easier than install. And a lot of folks are going to be shocked by that. They're going to be like, what do you mean installing controls is more difficult than programming? Well, the thing with programming is, and maybe it's just the way we teach programming in our programming course, but what we've seen is that programming follows a series of patterns. And when I say that, what I mean is, so for example, enabling a chiller or enabling an air handler, both of which follow the same enable pattern. And that is that typically there's a comparator object that looks at temperature, either enabling it that way, saying, hey, if the outdoor air is above a certain point, we can enable the chiller. And then you think about the air handler and you think about economizer control. Well, that's driven by outdoor air too. So it's the same logic pattern, but used in two different programs. And so when you start to learn these logic patterns, oh, that's a comparator block that feeds out a Boolean output that goes into a switch to enable something, or enables a PID, or goes into an AND block and looks for a occupancy schedule point. And if those two are true, then that's an enable point as well. Well, as you start to identify these patterns, there's only so many of them, and you can start to piece them together and actually create programs pretty fast. Now with install, it's kind of all over the place because there's many different ways of wiring things up. There's many different ways of how you need to go and mount controllers and do trunks and addressing, install. And when I say install, I consider not just installing the controls, but also connecting them to the supervisory device, mapping points in, etc., etc. That is more complex than programming because there's so many more tasks and patterns that you need to learn. So a lot of folks have in their head that learning programming is extremely difficult, when in actuality, the install and the setup of the front end and the server, that tends to be the more difficult. Now, sure, yes, I completely agree. There are some wonky programs out there that are very difficult that require a lot of experience. But if we use the Pareto principle, which is that, 20% of tasks are going to take up 80% of your time, well, then you think about that, right? That those 20% of programming that you're going to be doing is going to be programming that is not going to be, or is rather going to be that complex programming, which are those crazy wonky programs. But that other 80% of the programming is going to be VAV boxes, fan coil units, stuff like that you can fit in, that a newer person can take on. So yes, you will have some programs on some projects that will eat up a ton of your programming time. And those are complex. You're going to need a very experienced person. I don't disagree with that. But the majority of the programs that you're going to do, VAV boxes, rooftops, basic mixed air, single path control, basic air-cooled chillers, things like that, are programs that with limited skill, you can learn how to actually program those. And we've seen that time and time again in our programming course, where folks come in with very limited, if any, programming knowledge and leave programming VAV boxes, rooftops, and air-cooled chillers, which are the majority of what you will find outside of, large campuses and hospitals. All right, so then insight 3, proper install and point-to-point is all about patterns. So if I said programming is easier than install, well, what makes install difficult? What makes point-to-point difficult? Well, it's difficult because of patterns, and there's a lot of different patterns you need to learn and processes you need to learn in order to execute. And I think this was kind of the part where our courses started to evolve, because the beginning of our business, our courses were focused on knowledge. So BAS knowledge, HVAC knowledge, IT knowledge, protocol knowledge. But it's right about, I think, our 6th course that we started to look at much more hands-on skills, because we assumed if you went through those baseline courses, you would have the working knowledge to be able to implement what we call our practical courses. These are things like our startup and checkout, our design course, our programming course, which are very hands-on. And what I started to notice, what helped students and what we got a lot of positive feedback on, was processes. And as I started to work with the larger organizations, I noticed that they had processes, but I noticed mid-sized to small organizations, a lot of them did not have processes. They did not have processes for onboarding an electrician. They did not have processes and patterns for how you install inputs. Literally, each time an input was installed, you either knew it from experience or you had to figure it out. There was no library of patterns for your installation processes. So that was another big discovery as we started to develop more courses, was that, hey, these courses really need to have a lot of patterns and processes and checklists. And as we started to implement those, we saw the ability of folks to take and apply the subject matter much faster. And as I think back to manufacturer training, very few manufacturer courses. And I think this is something that those of you who do manufacturer training out there, if you're listening to this episode, this is something you could apply to your training that would be really valuable, which is checklists, processes, standard operating procedures, things like that. Building those things in to your courses really, really massively improves student retention, as well as the ability of students to execute the tasks. I find too many workbooks, and we'll talk about this a little later in the episode, too many workbooks are focused on, all right, do this step, but only in this particular order, in this particular scenario. And that step does not necessarily apply to other scenarios. And thus, the person goes through the course and they come out and they're like, oh crap, this scenario is different. How do I apply this? Versus with patterns and processes and checklists, it's independent of the scenario. So it really helps. So insight number 4 I found is that most project managers have had to figure it out on their own. So I'm really proud of our latest course, our Project Manager Bootcamp. There's nothing else like it in the market. And as I look at it and how it teaches folks to forecast and manage projects, it's just a beautiful course and it's super effective. And the reason it is because I did a lot of interviewing of project managers prior to recording the course. And I guess that would be like insight 12 is if you're going to create any training, interview the subject matter experts before you create it. But by talking with these people, I realized they had to figure a lot of things out on their own. And they had to figure out how to forecast. They had to go and figure out kind of what is the relationship between AP and AR. How do you go and schedule? How do you handle change orders? How do you handle communication? What are project kickoffs? A lot of this stuff was not ratified within their own organizations. So they just kind of had to figure it out. And that is why you'll see project managers, at least from our data, have a pretty high churn rate. If you survive the first couple years as a project manager, you tend to stay a project manager for a long time. But based on our data, we're looking at a 70 to 80% churn rate on project managers. That's way higher than technicians. That's way higher than programmers. I think that's the highest churn rate besides for salespeople, out of all the different the roles we've looked at. And that is because of the lack of processes and the lack of organizational structure around project management. So we found that while a lot of these folks have to do it on their own, by putting some processes in place, by putting some structured approach to project management in place, companies are really able to increase the profitability of their projects. Insight number 5, and this is more for individuals, but getting into BAS the traditional way is broken. So originally we had about a 50-50 split. 50% of the students would be self-pay. 50% of the students would be corporations. Now it's around 70-30, 60-40, depending on the course, where most of our new students are coming from companies that are either hiring people with no experience or hiring people out of a college, and then they're putting them in our training tracks. They're putting them in a technician track or in a programmer track. But what I've noticed of the remaining 40 to 30% of our students who are trying to enter the field, because we get quite a few people who will go through our training, the ones who are successful are the ones who do not follow the traditional system. If you go and despite having training and you put it on your resume, if you do not have, like if you're listening to me right now, which you obviously are, but you're someone trying to get into this field, I would tell you the best thing you can do is for whatever manufacturer you're trying to get into, get their manufacturer training. So if you're trying to work for a Niagara shop, get Niagara certified. If you're trying to work for a ALC shop, get ALC training if you can. If you're trying to work for a Schneider shop, get Schneider training if you can. Where there's a will, there's a way. I'm sure money talks and you can get someone to let you into the training. That being said, Putting that on paper will get you past the HR screens. Problem is you've got to go through the manufacturer training, and you're going to go through the training and you're really not going to have the background to make practical use of the training. So you're literally getting a piece of paper. That way you can go and get hired. So that traditional way is broken. So what I've actually found that works quite well is to invest in your training, build your own lab, go and actually learn tasks and processes, and then come to not the hiring manager, but actually try to find the operational manager who has P&L responsibility, profit and loss responsibility, and get with them and explain to them what you've done to develop yourself and how you are improving your skills. The students of ours who have done that almost have 100% hire rate and 100% retention rate. We've got student after student who has gone through our programs, followed that pattern. I think I talked about it in like episode 160, how to do that. I laid it out in great detail. But followed that pattern and then was able to get hired and are still employed, and if not promoted. It's really cool. I will say one of our downsides as a business has been talking more about the companies we've worked with and the student success stories. We've been pretty poor on marketing, as I've been solely focused on training quality and skill development and haven't really focused on marketing and messaging that. I mean, if you think of a company, we've trained their people. So I mean, we've pretty much trained all the large companies out there and most of the mid-sized companies, and we're starting to penetrate a lot of the small-sized companies as well. So training is valuable, but more so than training being valuable, it's how you communicate that training. And like I said, there's multiple episodes on getting hired. If you go to buildingautomationmonthly.com/podcast and you go into the search bar and you type, I think career would be the best word to type. It will give you so many episodes. I really encourage you to listen to them. It'll give you a great perspective on how to get hired. All right. Insight number 6, design submittals are all about spec adherence. So when we created our submittal course, so how to design submittals from scratch, basically we take a MEP set and a spec set and we create submittals. I was like, how are we going to teach this course? What can we teach? Because there was no course, and there still really isn't a course out there that teaches you how to create submittals. So how do we do that? How do we create submittals? Well, the thing I've found throughout my career dealing with rejected submittals was it was almost always about spec adherence. I mean, if you're rushing through things, you can mess stuff up from a design perspective, get it a little wonky, but if you use the RFI, RFC process properly, you're going to get the technical aspects of the design correct. Most of the time, design submittals are rejected is because of improper spec adherence. You didn't properly organize the documents. You didn't submit them at the right time. You didn't submit them to the right people. You didn't use the proper type of formatting, etc., etc. I actually see quite a few spec or design submittals that are rejected because of spec adherence, quite more than actually technical accuracy, which was really surprising to me because I know I'd seen that in my career, but I thought maybe that was just a unique case. But as I started to get feedback from the students, especially on the sections of spec adherence, and they started to talk to me about the processes we have and the checklist we have around spec adherence in the course, they said, man, implementing those checklists, I've seen my submittal rejections drop substantially. And more importantly, I've seen my submittal approval times increase, or I guess decrease, right? They've gotten faster. They've went from weeks to days, which was pretty significant and was really a cool thing to see. So insight number 7 is that you don't need to be a mechanic to get into controls. So this is something that for the longest time I thought, and it was a value of mine. It was like a personal value. I was almost like on a crusade because I came from the Navy. I didn't have a mechanical background. And yet every time I talk to someone, they're like, you got a mechanical background? And I'd be like, no. And it's almost like you're a second-class citizen. And maybe it was just my own ego and my own insecurities. But I felt like people would say, oh, well, you don't have a mechanical background. You haven't been to a trade school. You're self-taught. You can't really be that good at controls. And I'm like, watch me. I'm like, like hold my beer. I'll be right back. No, but seriously, I would be, I'm going to show you. And what I started to realize is that your knowledge of controls is much more important on controls theory than mechanical systems. Don't get me wrong, you do need to know what VAV boxes are, thermodynamics, psychrometrics, all those kind of things, but you don't need to be a mechanic necessarily to get those skills. And I see that hold a lot of folks back who have strong electrical backgrounds, who have strong IT backgrounds. And you'll get a lot of folks who will tell you, because of how they progressed through their career, that if you don't have that mechanical background, you can't be as effective. I would disagree. I've seen student after student after student who has electrical, IT, test and balance. I guess you could kind of argue that's mechanical, but has various backgrounds, and yet they're getting hired into controls and being very effective in controls. Now, on the flip side, I don't mean to disparage having a mechanical background. That is not at all what I want you to hear. So insight number 8 for a lot of mechanics getting into control is mostly a mental block. There are easily ways around the salary problem. And when I say salary problem, a lot of mechanics will say, well, I'm a union mechanic, I'm going to take a pay cut. Or I've been doing this for so many years, I'm going to take a pay cut. When in actuality, there are many strategies, and I've discussed this in detail, I know for a fact, in at least 2 episodes, so I'm not going to get too much into that. But what I haven't discussed in detail is that for a lot of mechanics, getting into controls is mostly a self-imposed mental block. If you can read those complicated ass mechanical diagrams and troubleshoot those kind of things, and you can understand all the concepts of psychrometrics, of the refrigeration cycle, things like that, then you have the technical aptitude to be a controls tech. It is a mental block often that, oh, it's computer stuff. Oh, it's abstract. Oh, I've got to learn to program. Oh, I'm not good with IT, etc., etc. But you have the technical aptitude for learning those topics. It is literally just getting past the mental block, the kind of culturally self-imposed belief that has just permeated the mechanical culture for whatever reason, and it just boggles my mind, especially since mechanical systems were some of the first IoT systems. We were doing smart equipment before we were ever doing smart controls. So this belief that mechanics can't work with technology systems, I find, is largely a mental block that once folks choose to let that go, they're able to learn the technical side of controls quite easily. Insight number 9, I've learned that there's one team structure that seems to work better than all others. So talking with a bunch of different companies, I noticed a pattern that the companies that would be above 10 million in annual revenue seem to have the same or very similar organizational structures. They tended to have the ops and the construction and the service team separated. They tended to have the construction team run very much like a conveyor belt, where you would have installers/technicians, you would have programmers, designers, project managers, and graphics people. And each subject matter expert would be doing their expertise on multiple different projects at a time, and a PM would pull from this pool of talent and would utilize them to execute work. This is in contrast to $10 million and below, where it was jack of all trades. So you would have a professional who would know how to do everything. This person would be the PM. This person would be the programmer, the designer, the technician, everything. They would rely on subcontractors occasionally for electrical work, but sometimes not. I've seen that in order for organizations, and this is the really cool part, is I've watched organizations, especially since the economy's upticked, I've watched them scale from 7 figures to 8 figures. And watching them scale, they naturally implement that team structure. So if you are a business owner sitting in of revenue below 10 million per year, then I really encourage you to utilize the team structure of essentially the assembly line, where you have subject matter experts who work on different tasks in their groups, and you have group managers, and those group managers oversee the allocation of these subject matter experts to projects. So that works really well. Now, on the service side, you're still very much utilizing jack of all trades methodology just because of the nature of service. But on the construction side, if you really want to scale, that's how you do it. So insight number 10, and I kind of referenced this in the previous episode or earlier in the episode, is that the traditional workbook module is broken and doesn't result in critical thinking. So I myself have been through a ton of manufacturer training, and it is really good at getting you to understand how to use the manufacturer software. Where it is really bad, typically, is how to utilize those softwares outside of the situations presented in the workbooks. So the workbooks are traditionally perform this step, and you literally follow step by step. So if you can read and you can navigate the UI of the software, you're going to be able to be successful in these manufacturer training classes. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not meaning to bash manufacturer training. That is not what I'm meaning to do. I actually, in our courses, refer folks to manufacturer training. When customers ask us, what do I recommend? I will typically recommend they take a technician or programmer path, and they follow those paths up with the manufacturer training for the course. Because once you have the underlying skills, you then have the context to apply what you learned in the manufacturer training. So you'll come into this manufacturer training with context, understanding the processes that are involved in installer programming. And you can understand, hey, if I'm outside of this scenario, then I can still apply this manufacturer software because I have the critical thinking capabilities to apply that. That's why I think folks like to hire from trade schools, because they do give that capability. The problem with trade schools is they take too freaking long to get someone to where they need to be. And there are some trade schools that, let's be honest, the folks who are teaching, if they've been in the field, they haven't been in it for several years, if at all. And so how can they impart the knowledge? I'm sure they're teaching off of a syllabus and a lesson plan, but there's something to be said about having actually been up at 2:00 in the morning, troubleshooting a train lawn system, surviving off of Monster Energy drinks because you managed to wipe out the LNS database. There's something about that experience that is very difficult to manufacture and transfer to students unless you've done it. So don't at all mean to be critical of that environment. It's worked for a lot of people. It's just not as effective. That's why you see a lot of these Code Academy and boot camps like that with these 3 to 9 month cycles of development. And I think that's where our industry, at least I know that's where our business is. And it's been very successful. And finally, insight number 11 is IT knowledge is severely lacking in our industry. I mean, holy crap, it is lacking across our assessment. So on our technical skill assessment, the average score is around 50%. And then we test across a multitude of different skills. And what I see consistently is the IT section is the lowest performing section across the assessment, across the board. And so at first I thought to myself, well, that just means the questions are crap. That just means they're hard questions. They're not good questions. And that's why people are doing poorly. But recently I've had several IT folks go through the assessment. And while they did not do well on the HVAC side, they were in the 70 to 90% on the IT question section. So that told me this is a knowledge problem, not a question problem. But what I've noticed is that the temptation is to enroll in a Network Plus course, to go to, actually, I've had several of our students before they went into our IT course say to me, Phil, I'm going to get an associate's in IT. And I said, look, I've got a master. Well, I will have a master's in IS and in cybersecurity as soon as they figure out what the heck they're doing with my graduation, which they still can't seem to figure that out for some reason. But once that's figured out, I will have that. And having gone through the IS track and having gone through the cybersecurity track, I know from experience that what you get taught is way overkill. I mean, it's really been awesome. It was really cool to learn about positive and negative bit signaling on wires, but you don't need to know that. So really, there's only a couple things folks need to know, and I've discussed this in previous episodes, so I'm not going to beat this to death either, but there's only so many things folks need to know in order to succeed with IT. And so I really encourage you, if that's interesting to you, go back to our podcast at buildingautomationmonthly.com/podcast and look up the topic of IT, and we'll cover the things you need to know. It's not that much. Don't feel overwhelmed. So what I'm hoping you come out of this episode with is an appreciation for where we're at as an industry from both a learning perspective and a development perspective, as well as from what skills are needed. I hope these insights are valuable to you. I hope that if you're looking to develop your team or to develop yourself, that you will consider our training courses. I'd really love to have you as one of our students. And you can find out more about those by going to buildingautomationmonthly.com/store or going to buildingautomationmonthly.com/178, scrolling down to the Building Automation Monthly logo and clicking on that, and that will tell you about our corporate training program. With that being said, thanks a ton for being here. I can't wait to talk to you all again in episode 179. And until next time, take care.